Thank you, David, for the commercial. That's going to save 5 minutes off of this talk. I've got a slide, haven't I? Sorry. I should explain straight away that although we've made films and books, and we make TV documentaries, and we've actually made the first 2 movies ever on methane hydrates, one for Julian's broadcast, one for the BBC, we have never made a PowerPoint presentation, and we don't give talks. Also, we've never touched a PC in our lives. So this could be interesting. This is a bit of an experiment. So Gary, who's helped us this morning, has been battling with the PC Mac interface, nobly with one of my colleagues. This might work. So, good, it is working. We've had the commercial. We've been around, I've got to do this. David told me we needed to tell you what was going to happen today. This is for the benefit of the camera at the back. I intend to tell you a little bit about communication, a little bit about us, set a test and see if we can meet that test, and talk about the challenges that I think all of the room have to be aware of in terms of getting CCS to be accepted by the public, tell you, hopefully, engage you in conversation around what happens if you don't engage, and then give you 10 top tips to help you on your way. So David's given us the commercial. We've been around a long time. I think we've now filmed in 63 countries, and one of our claims to fame is we've filmed over 100 degrees centigrade, in other words, from minus 50 to plus 50. Got lots of good clients, thank goodness. And we cover topics across the energy game, from access to new fields right through to decommissioning. And we do a lot of work around technology as well as CSR. Now, if I were to put to you the test that we put to all our clients at the start of any project, we would say to our client, okay, you're going to spend money with us, hopefully. You're certainly hopefully going to spend some time.
Yeah, good. And you? Good holidays and stuff?
Who's that? Some money, some time, some blood, sweat and tears. And it would be good to know up front if you could define what success would be. Now, for me today, success would be that everybody in the room is more aware of the potential risk of having their project in CCS stopped by lack of public engagement, and then invests an appropriate amount to overcome that risk. Now, this is not an academic paper. This is just a few reflections from having been producing communications around CCS since 2003 and watching this whole industry burgeon into existence. But I have had some academic support from Ben Headley. Is Ben in the room? No, Ben is a student of John Lewis, I think possibly the first PhD student in the world who is combining a geoscience approach to CCS along with the public understanding. So, like any good communication, any good story, I want to start at the beginning. And this particular story starts nearly 40 years ago, in 1,000 feet under Nottingham. And I turned up there after 3 years of being enthused with geology by Janet and her colleagues up the road, and walked into a colliery that was about to hit a major problem. This was the era when coal powered this country. About 78% of electricity was coal produced, coal powered, and the manager of this particular colliery had a problem. He had 5 faces working in dreadful new seam, which was absolute rubbish, and he had 1 good face in what remnant there was of a really rather nice seam. And I discovered that he was about to hit a fault. Now, this was not clever science. This is just joining dots up on a map. And full of enthusiasm, I tried to explain to him, and he didn't want to listen. He couldn't listen because of the pressure he was under from the great God-produced coal daily. So he refused to see me, he didn't answer phone calls, and obviously ignored memos. So the inevitable happened, and one night I was called to go down the pit, and I'm crawling along the face, the clean coal, about 1 metre thick, was cut by a classic little fault and hard white sandstone stretched off into the distance in the lamp. I was very happy because it's the first I'd seen underground, and it also came in exactly where we predicted it would, not difficult. So I popped back at the pit top, went to see him, walked into his office, big desk, small chap behind the desk, and said, I've seen it. And he said, what's it like, Madook? I said, well, it's fabulous, Mr. Darlow. It's absolutely fabulous, wonderful. It's a classic textbook example, and it's come in just where we predicted. He got up from behind the desk and he came up and he grasped me warmly by the throat and said, if you use the word beautiful about a fault, I'll put your teeth down to your bollocks. Now, the moral of this is, I think, that no matter how enthusiastic you are about your science and no matter how good the data is, if you don't communicate well enough to your public, you're going to run into problems. Now, let's turn to today, and I'm grateful that David has introduced us. David often talks about the past, and when we were getting ready for this, I found an old tin of film which was enigmatically labelled David's Formative Years, and it came with some accompanying notes. So if we're lucky with the technology, we might see, yes please Gary, we might see something that could be a bit of early David, or maybe we've got PC. No, we've got no, sorry folks, we'll move on. Very sad about that. Right. Anyway, David has been a believer in this need to bridge the gap between, we've got another interface problem here, to bridge the gap between science and the rest of the world. And one little story of his is trying to get the team who were exploring here to understand that they could not pursue their craft in geophysics or geology or drilling unless they involved the entire government apparatus of Angola. And we made a film to look at the linkage between the public relations, as it were, the government relations of BP and the subsurface community. And it's interesting to reflect that David and BP thought it worth the investment to help the geoscientists and the drillers and the government relationships see either side of that argument. I think there are parallels between the little story down the pit and this story. You have CCS driven by the enthusiasm of scientists and technologists, and you have an audience who haven't heard of it, don't understand it, or feel threatened by it. I'd like to try and prove that. This is, as some of you know, Insala, and this is where I got my introduction to CCS, a BP Statoil Sonatrach project deep in the Sahara. And we were involved in filming the construction of the site back in 2003. That's one of the main vessels being lifted off. And here is the CO2 injection line coming out of the separation unit, off on its way to what you might claim is the world's first CCS, solely CCS injection well. I think Insala is an example of the power of the scientist and the technologist to come up with a solution to a problem, and also the power of big companies, Statoil, BP, with Sonatrach, putting words into action and doing something. And we're talking about sequestering 1 million tons a year of CO2 underneath the Sahara. The team at Insala asked us to help them prepare communications for an international partnership which was designed primarily to promote research into carbon capture and storage, and there's a good group of interested parties there. This CCP, CO2 capture project, was mainly staffed up by scientists and technologists, and they were shocked to discover that the environmental NGOs were not as enthusiastic as they were. And we were sent off to try and find out why. So we travelled to the States, to Europe, and around the UK, talking to NGO officials about things, and just putting to them, if you've got something as obvious as Sokolow and Pacala's wedges, which have now moved on. These days it's called the blue route, I don't know why, but that was Sokolow and Pacala's work. Why would you not go for a fix that could help you remove 25% of anthropogenic CO2? And the result was fascinating. There's Lake Nyos again. Lake Nyos came up in every conversation. There was no hope of arguing with them about flux or the very different possibilities of leakage from a site. And most people thought that CO2 was as dangerous as chlorine in the First War, and their view of the subsurface was that's porosity. This is not fair on the public to laugh at them, much as we might all do, but it's true. People think about fluids underground in lakes. So you meet with a wall of, frankly, ignorance, and that's a comment on our education system, not on the public. So our recommendation was, rapidly, we've got to give people some of the information so they can join in a dialogue. And we produced a number of tools, and I was going to show you a film from that. And we have to think about why would they object, because nobody objected at Insala, but there's nobody at Insala. This is the Foreign Legion fort. This is the remains of the Foreign Legion fort about 10 miles south of Insala, and I think you'd feel sorry for the French conscript who was, sorry, Dupont, you've got 2 years in Insala, that's all that's left. And those literally are the only neighbours. And you can see that we've got one of Brian's hot blobs raising the surface over here, putting a slope on this picture. So that was to be the film. We haven't got it. If your view of CCS is based on the science that you know, and you're interested in things like the effect of nickel on the corrosion rates in nickel steel or pore throats, you are not going to be influenced so much by what I call the Daily Express type of argument, the Daily Panic. My God, CCS is going to put the house prices down. But that's what the public have to put up with. We are not feeding them enough information to have a sensible debate. CCP asked us to make a number of things, and we came up with a communication campaign, which I should show you a little piece of now. This is a brochure for CCP, and it relies on a very simple idea. The main threat that people perceive is leakage. Most of the public have no clue about depth. They haven't dug anything deeper than a beam trench. So this little piece of paper helps them to get their perspective on deep storage. And gradually, the NGOs came round, and this is just a statement from a Friends of the Earth website. I think this has been successful because it's simple, and at this point I'd just like to point out one of the heroes of CCS Communications, Tony Bohr from Schlumberger Carbon Services. We've also been involved in a little bit of work. There's this thing called In Depth, and we've worked for Schlumberger on another rather simple idea, telling people about the process involved in planning and implementing a CCS project, and helping utilities to understand how complex it is and how you need a different mindset from an engineering mindset. You need a geoscience mindset as well as engineering to get it to work. Tony, if you've ever seen him speak, has a most remarkable high-tech prop. He has a piece of string, and he uses it to great effect to remind people about depth and boreholes. So we need to be thinking, how much does our audience know before we get into the sort of explanation that you might wish to give if you had an academic paper? Now, the Carbon Capture Project and other organizations around the world, and I compliment ZEP in Europe, Zero Emissions Project, have got politicians in Europe to a state where at least CCS is mentioned in some policy statements. Sadly, it's not happening quite as fast as we would like, and this is the front cover and index to a paper that we wrote. We were asked to write as a consultant to the DTI, and the idea was to survey the state of public engagement and come up with a set of recommendations which we did. The official who paid for it was very happy and ran off saying that he would look for the money to implement some of this. It hasn't happened. I'm still hopeful. It's only 6 years since that paper was landed. This is a map. You can look at this on the GCSI, the Global CCSI Institute down in Australia. There are a lot of projects which are being planned. And here's a European map. A lot of projects being planned. Some are happening. But more worryingly, some have already been stopped. And this has been alluded to this morning by earlier speakers. Some have been stopped by public action, direct public action, also by apathy from politicians. So we have a problem. Anything that is stopped is going to cost huge money, huge money. If you don't get it right, you're going to hit this. I call it the NIMBY war. We've heard about NIMBYs. NIMBYs not under my backyard. And the NIMBY war is growing, and it's growing stronger. And I wish you to be well aware of how powerful it is. If you get it wrong, if you don't understand the public, if you don't communicate with them, they will stop you. Now, who are the public? Well, we're all the public, but I want to talk about the range of public. And to start with, in typical science fashion, let's look at an N member of the spectrum. Somebody who's approaching, a data point who's approaching the limits. Does anybody know who this man is? Swampy, yes. Well, his real name is Daniel Hooper. And back at the building of the Newbury bypass, he and a small group of chums managed to hold up the development of that, which had been requested by anybody who'd ever been on the A34. You desperately wanted a bypass. I'm not saying it was good or bad, but there was a lot of public opinion for the bypass. Swampy Prot and his chums probably held it up by over a year and around £100 million. I argue that if this community, the CCS community or the geoscience community, does not communicate well enough to the public, then a Swampy, whether he's a Brit, a Frenchman, a German, doesn't matter, and his chums will hold it up and cause serious problems. Here's a little quote from Friends of the Earth. Swampy lost, in his terms. The bypass was built much to the delight of people in Newbury and anybody who's ever used the A34. But Friends of the Earth saw it in a different way. This government will never try another Newbury. If you've got one Swampy digging in on the site of your exploratory well or laying in front of your VIB on a seismic line, I think we've got problems. I said earlier this is not academic. I have tried to read the papers from the social sciences on public engagement, and frankly I didn't understand them, but I've been around a little while to know what we think works. So I want to move on to 10 top tips for minimizing risk. And the first one is to learn from the past. Everybody thinks they've seen that. Unfortunately, you haven't, because it's a victim of its own, ironically, it's a victim of what it's trying to say itself. The real quote, apparently, is the bottom one. I think it's more pertinent because we want to remember the past. We're not going to be ignorant of it. We want to remember the past. And the past I want to refer to is the past in industries that have tried and failed with public communication. The nuclear industry. They got public buy-in possibly back in the days of Howard Wilson and Too Cheap to Measure. They've lost it. The GM industry, don't think they ever had it. In our own industry, here's a classic case. Shell, who by any standard seem to have got everything right in engineering terms, and had a proposal to get rid of Brent Spar. And because they did not, unfortunately, get the communication battle right, were forced into action which was six times less safe, 4 times the cost, and had a greater environmental impact. This is a statement from an article from Shell, and it's intriguing. This morning we've heard that Shell is a leader in CCS. But Brent Spar was perhaps a wake-up call to many people in engineering that what seems rational to you may not seem rational to the public. And this is a huge differentiator between the sort of regime that you have to work in on a daily basis, where decisions are made, data-rich decisions-making process, and the public who are not in the same business, they are in the business of emotion. Let's look at the cost. This is a page from this brochure which we produced for Yorkshire First, that's an RDA, who is planning Britain's first CCS network. They're trying to get together about £2 billion to put in a network of high-pressure pipes to collect CO2 from the many large-scale emitters in Yorkshire and Humberside. My back-of-envelope calculation suggests a month's delay is around 10 million, so you don't want many swampies on that. So number 2 is calculate the cost of effective communication, calculate the cost of getting it wrong, and then work out the difference. That's a piece of pure business. Third one is very much define your target audience. This is a rather basic map, but the idea is to think about the differences across the channel. A long time ago, a tunnel was built. Wonderful. The tunnel was connected from Paris to Calais by the TGV very effectively, and then sometime later on by high-speed link from Folkestone up to London. The TGV in France was running 13 years before the high-speed link from Folkestone. I would therefore argue, if you look at that, why did that happen? It's because you have a completely different planning regime, you have a different political regime, you have a different trade union regime, you have a different NGO regime. So if you can look at the audiences in where you're going to operate, you want to put your CCS project, you might decide on this sort of basis that in some countries you need to deal more with national, regional politicians and trade unions, and in another country you might wish to target NGOs. Your audience, I think we're ignorant of our next door neighbours in many cases, let alone the general public. And I would urge you to think, once you've defined the audiences that you want to reach, to consider who are they? What do they know? What don't they know? What worries them? Is it a lake of toxin underneath their back garden? Is it the possibility of not having a job? Is it the possibility of exploding pipelines? Find out. And then craft your message. And it is a sad truth that carrots are, perhaps it's not a sad truth, perhaps it's just a truth, carrots are more effective than sticks in most of the societies we live in. And as soon as you engage in a conversation about something changing in a village, a community, you will start to hear this question, what's in it for me? Now, I think we can craft messages around CCS which are appealing on many levels. Yorkshire RDA talks in here about job creation. It talks about industries that will only locate in places where CCS networks exist to get rid of carbon. If we can assure people, if we can provide them with evidence that the risk is minimal and there are benefits, then I suggest your project would have a better starting point. This is indication of the next. This rather bizarre statement, and I apologise for the rather small type size. I always said I'd never stand up in front of anybody and apologise for small type, but it's true. This comes from a 40-page, lavishly illustrated brochure that we've been sent by an exploration and production company to rewrite. The illustrations are beautiful, very expensively designed and printed. And when you read this, you think, well, that's not too bad, is it? It would be fine if the audience were school children. However, it's designed for chief executives of international oil companies and NOCs. I think it's a classic case of the mismatch between the scientists and technologists who are doing some extremely good innovative work in exploration and EOR, and their public relations department, who probably have never seen an oil well, and got this from Dorling Kindersley's junior book of oil and gas. So the next point really is, if you're going to make a communication, for God's sake, get the level right. Find people who are on your wavelength and can build a bridge for you. This is another one that really got to me. I was in a meeting, some of you probably there, the European Carbon Summit last year in London, and a high-ranking European official stood up and said, "We've just produced a very expensive brochure. The only problem is, ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I've been asked what's on the front cover and I don't know, and some people think it's a fetus in the womb." The rest of it is in a similar wonderful mode. It plays directly, in my view, into everybody's fears. If you look at this and try and analyse it, you've got a massive lake growing here, you've got shafts, not wells. It's an abomination, in my view. I'm angry because it's very poor. It goes against all the good work, which in fact Europe has done, as well as many other people, but I'm paying for it, as are you. This is our taxpayers' money going into stuff, and have a look at this afterwards. You have paid for that. So the plea is here, find the right register, find people who can write to build bridges and come up with diagrams which are hopefully a lot more informative than that, and get the scales right. Soon finished. Best communication routes. It's lovely to see Julian Rush here from Channel 4, indicative of one extraordinarily important communication route. I haven't spoken to Julian, but I suspect he'd be delighted when looking for a story to talk to people who have actually got practical experience and have got ideas to share. So do newspaper reporters. There are dozens and dozens of ways out there. Don't just stick to one. Just think about all your audience. Once you've categorized them and you have some understanding of what they need to know or would like to know to further the argument, then you've got all sorts of ways. Many people tell us, "Oh, I've got a website." Say, "Great, how do I find a website?" Websites are passive. They are repositories of knowledge. They are not a proactive communication, so please don't rely on websites. And now this one, use plain language. I put that there because this is a story about Niels Bohr, the physicist, who said in his biography that on the way home from the lab every night he used to call in for a beer. If he couldn't explain to the barmaid what he'd been working on that day, then he didn't understand it well enough. I think if plain language is good enough for Niels Bohr, it's probably certainly good enough for me and for the rest of us. So stick to language which people can understand. And that's there because I think we badly, badly need powerful and trusted advocates. This is, in any poll, the most trusted man in Britain. He is probably unavailable to talk about CCS. It has been mentioned in this very room. But I think as a community you need to find advocates who would be trusted, and they don't trust oil men, forget it. Somebody who can stand up in front of an audience and talk with passion about the benefits of CCS, talk with reality about the risks of CCS, and talk with understanding about public concern. Possibly the last speaker is that man, the last speaker. Lastly, 10th point, you can't delay. You've got to start now, and on that, I'll stop. Thank you.
We're running a bit behind.